Hello everybody, we might get going. Thank you very much everyone for joining us this morning to talk about net zero and specifically to allow us to share with you some observations we have about how your business may plan and prepare for its net zero future. My name is Edward Hanna. I'm the General Manager of the Corporate Solutions team here at Energy Action. I've been on my own net zero journey for a couple of decades now, here within the business and personally. And I'm being joined by Janine Hill, who leads our advisory practice within our corporate solutions team. Janine has an engineering background, in addition, many years experience in sustainability practice, sustainability data management, energy efficiency, energy reduction, very well credentialed to take questions here today, which is how we're going to run the session. I'll be doing the talking and Janine will be supporting me by answering questions that may come up through the course of things. So, you can see we've got about 60 odd people joining, so without further ado, I'll push in. If you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat functions, and we'll do our best to address them as we go. Okay, so what we're going to work through today, we're going to talk through net zero, a bit of the what, a bit of the why, a bit of the when. We'll maybe touch on goals versus aspirations. Then I wanted to talk to how net zero can be aligned to your business goals within your companies, your organisations, and the importance of making the business case stack up. We've got a few tips and pointers that we can offer there that might be useful to you. And the third piece, building net zero credibility. We think this is really important. It's going to be important for any business case. I guess our observation is that net zero is a market response to a market failure. The failure is well institutionalised. It's the failure to correctly price the impact of carbon into production around the globe. As a result, as a market response, claims of net zero should be subject to scrutiny and should be robust and verifiable. What we would like to set as an outcome for today is to support you to make credible and achievable net zero plans for your business, and then to give you, as I say, some pointers to help you get the support you need within your business to act upon those plans. Okay, so the what of net zero. In response to climate change, many countries have taken on a net zero goal. It's a goal that came out of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and it's based on the observation that a 2-degree increase in temperature in this century is potentially cataclysmic for humanity. There's a whole lot of probabilities, and maybe in just about every statement I'm going to make here today in relation to the what and the when of net zero, so please bear with me as I make those. I'll be as brief as I can. Net zero entails the concept of a global carbon budget. The shorthand is that if there are too many carbon emissions relative to that budget, then temperatures will rise. It's a beautiful, crisp, cool, clear day here in Sydney today. It's easy to forget how dramatic and I guess how poignant climate change and out of control temperature conditions can be in this country. The southeast corner of Australia had its experience earlier this year, so we are well aware of it. As we've come through COVID, it's put a little bit on the back burner. We wanted to let you know that we're still thinking about it and we're still working towards it in our business. The essence of net zero is that to avoid an increase of 2 degrees in the average global temperature, humans need to stop emitting carbon by 2050. The way to get there is pretty straightforward. We've got to, as a global population, is to reduce man-made carbon greenhouse emissions, well, eliminate in fact, reduce those ones that you're responsible for, and then offset the remaining balance through removal activities. Okay, we've developed a simple schema that we use here at Energy Action to assist our clients prioritise and think through their approach to net zero. We use this because we do think that every business can do something, and every business has a responsibility to think about net zero. We're not saying that every one of the steps in our schema is simple, but we do think every step is achievable. The steps are listed there on the screen today. The first, measuring your carbon impact. We could run another webinar, perhaps a series, perhaps a year's worth of webinars on the intricacies of measuring your carbon impact and defining scope. We won't do that, but we will talk to the concepts today. Reduce your carbon emission as much as possible through using less energy and energy efficiency. Shifting to on-site renewable energy and electric vehicles. So wherever there is an energy conversion taking place in your business, start making the move towards technologies that can do that with lower or no carbon. Procurement is absolutely key. Setting the agenda through your procurements for off-site renewable energy, and then anything that can't be taken out of your business because your business fundamentally is producing carbon or emitting carbon, then offset that balance through the surrender of carbon certificates. Okay, I wanted to include this infographic here. It's from the World Green Building Council. Energy Action has been involved with the Green Building Council of Australia for a number of years, and the WGBC is the peak body that sits across various green building councils around the world. It gives us a useful overview of how different organisations and sectors are embracing net zero in their policy settings and defining the agenda for the next 30 years of their activity. Working from top to bottom, for the World Green Building Council, they've set a definition specific to buildings, obviously, and net zero carbon building is highly energy efficient, with all remaining energy from on-site and off-site renewable sources. There's a real focus here on energy in the property sector and the GBCA. They've set 2 goals. The first, for 2030, all new buildings must operate at net zero carbon, and by 2050, 100% of buildings must operate at net zero carbon. The language there is pretty dogmatic. They're obviously keen to insist upon that vision for their members and stakeholders in the building construction cycle. On the left-hand side, some of the mechanisms that they're going to employ to deliver on those goals, engaging with governments, setting building standards, some work that Energy Action has been involved with over the last couple of years. We've had some significant input into the 2019 construction code, defining the energy efficiency standards for new builds for 2019. Training and education, not only of the construction sector, but also the FM and investment sector, facilities management and investment sectors. Corporate engagement, ensuring that investors are attending to this on their agenda. And then the third piece, certification, making sure that claims are robust and verifiable. The principles that the GBCA are going to pursue, the WGBC are going to pursue are listed on the right-hand side. Measure and disclose carbon. Fundamentally, this is where it starts, and it's largely where it ends too. Measuring, defining your scope, defining what's in and out of your carbon boundary, and then disclosing it, reporting it, and standing by your commitments to reduce it. Reducing energy demands. Energy efficiency is high priority in buildings. Generate the balance from renewables, and then improve the verification. Interestingly, at this point, the WGBC is extending their definition of net zero to refer to waste and water, as well as just energy consumption. Okay, when of net zero. as I mentioned in the preamble, it's an outcome of the Paris Climate Agreements of 2015, and the focus is really about restricting temperature rises to below 2 degrees. I guess the critical thing here is the time, the t-axis. Humanity is hopefully, or these net zero aspirations are focused on reducing the pace of the increase in temperatures and indeed trying to stop it. On the assumption that you've seen enough images of charred kangaroos and confused koalas, I'm going to regale you with a highly selective set of statistics to make some points about net zero and timing today. Okay, there's, as I mentioned earlier as well, there's this concept of a carbon budget that in turn has an impact on global temperatures. As you can see on the left-hand side, the y-axis here, that's a 40 at the top. We are emitting 40 gigatons of CO2 around the planet each year, and progressively since the Industrial Revolution, this has had an impact on global temperatures. Okay, looking out to the future, if we obey the logic of that carbon budget, then at 40 gigatons or so of emissions, then we've got about 8 years before we will see temperature rises in excess, potentially in excess of 1.5 degrees, and 26 years before we see temperature rises in excess of 2 degrees. Hence, I guess a gradual sense of urgency that is building amongst corporates and certainly some state actors around the planet as well. Okay, interestingly, our corporates and businesses generally, our clients are telling us that action on climate change is an imperative. This, I guess, is another way to skin the cat of when for climate change, and the when is when our stakeholders in our business demand it, our clients, our employees, our investors, our leaders. That's when it's time for us to take action on climate change. We ran a survey in March across our client base. 80% of the respondents told us that action is needed on climate change. Interestingly, across all of those organisations, only 24% of the businesses tell us that they've begun their net zero journey. This kind of bears out with some other work that's been done, and I wanted to allude to it to give our survey some credibility, but also just to really make the point that stakeholders in Australia are demanding action on climate change. This is some pretty interesting work released by the ABC in February in the wake of the bushfires. Climate change is a serious problem and requires immediate action. 60% of Australians feel that way. And a further 24% of Australians feel that some action should be taken. So all up, 84% of Australians want action. If you get the chance to follow this link, we'll send it around today to you all. It's well worth a look. It's pretty compelling viewing, some great animation done there by the ABC. Net zero and climate change is obviously still political football in federal politics. I wanted to draw out today, though, that the states are certainly taking action on climate change and embracing the concept of net zero. The graphic on the left from ClimateWorks Australia makes the point that all Australian states and territories have embraced the concept of net zero. And indeed, all of the states, except Western Australia, and all the territories except NT, have actually set firm net zero emission targets by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement. Obviously, having federal buy-in to these would coordinate activities and potentially reduce some of the costs around the economy and send some clearer signals as well. But I guess the signal is that the states are getting on board and making sure that the net zero is something that Australians can look to over the future. This is in line with the OECD, with the exception of America as a US federally, although many states in the US have embraced net zero. And there's, as the comment there, 121 countries, 25% of global emissions have signed on to the Paris Agreement. A significant proportion of asset owners around the world have embraced net zero, and some of Australia's largest companies. The efforts by investors, certainly in Australia, is spearheaded by the Investor Group on Climate Change, but some large investors too, such as Blackstone, are getting profile for their statements about net zero as well. It's murky though, right? Blackstone hit the news today here in Sydney because it's got investments in a Chinese company which is developing a coal mine in Gunnedah. And that's obviously complex for BlackRock. In respect of some of the larger corporate brands that have made net zero claims, net zero statements, there's a lot of companies well down the track. Woolworths, Telstra, Atlassian have been very vocal and have taken strong action. Qantas as well, but also interestingly, Origin, BP, Shell, companies with large embodied carbon in their supply chains have also made net zero commitments. Okay, on the bottom right there, just wanted to highlight how quickly things are shifting in Australia. Again, from February, the Business Council of Australia, which in 2018, 2019 was opposed to the concept of net zero, is now saying that the federal government should legislate a target of net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, so what's happening around the economy? And thanks, guys, for posting some of those links. The ABC link is up in the chat if you're interested in grabbing that. Again, referring to some pretty cool work by ClimateWorks and Monash University, they're publishing tracker reports. They're delving deep into sustainability statements on corporate websites and on the ASX, to profile who's doing what at the top end of town. The Australian property sector has a good reputation in relation to net zero and carbon more generally, with more than 90% of the Australian property sector now on a net zero path, 43% of those with goals aligned to net zero, 47% not quite as strong. And we can see in that sector some pretty clear dynamics. Obviously, a commercial building has an easily definable emissions boundary, but also we've seen over many years, over the last couple of decades, some great programs such as NABERS, which Energy Action has been involved with for many decades, and also the government green lease, the CBD, Clean Building Disclosure Act, are also doing some of the heavy lifting across the real estate sector. The retail sector, 80% recognise the importance of the big brands, certainly recognise the importance of net zero and are taking some action towards net zero. A smaller proportion of brands are actually lined up with net zero commitments. Amazon, Aldi and Woolworths, Kathmandu as well stand out, but 65% of brands are doing something in relation to net zero. And at the local government leadership level, we are seeing leadership. So globally, 398 cities worldwide have embraced net zero by 2050 goals. Within Australia, I'm well aware that the Sydney City has, and a couple of other cities as well, have embraced a net zero goal. In fact, 58%, almost 60% of councils have announced targets or aspirations for net zero by 2050. In the space of net zero discussion, debate, there is a big gap between a target and an aspiration, and I I just wanted to highlight that for you. A target is used to describe a firm commitment, an aspiration, not quite so firm, but charting a direction towards net zero. So there's a big difference in how those two statements are interpreted. All right, just summarising down some of those observations. Larger brands are leading the push. Typically, they do have more brand exposure, more resources to absorb some of the research and transaction costs involved in leading the push towards net zero. Where we see that the following enablers are important. The data is controlled, the emission boundary is easily defined and in direct control. Property organisations. Also, we're seeing where investors and global capital, access to global capital demand a net zero agenda. We're seeing companies respond, and certainly where stakeholders, clients, customers, employees, where they expect a strong statement, we're seeing organisations respond, and that's certainly the case with councils. There's a question as to whether the leader companies are moving too early. Certainly the probabilities and risks associated with climate change are real and getting realer by the year. Are they moving too early? Well, I think there's certainly a risk that you'll be left behind and your brand might suffer negative perceptions as a result of that. And I think in order to attract global capital and to compete globally, particularly in European markets, there's a big expectation that organisations have a net zero commitment of some sort. Right, so aligning net zero to your business goals. I thought that we'd just delve a bit deeper into the survey we ran in March across our client base. It was our client satisfaction survey. We're particularly interested in the issue of net zero and carbon. We had 80 odd responses from our clients, and of those 80 clients, 80% told us that businesses need to take action regarding climate change. Only 24% of those organisations, as I mentioned before though, think their businesses are now incorporating net zero into their corporate strategy. An interesting observation here is that while decision makers were pretty highly aligned across all of the other organisations, all of the other respondents, with 77% of decision makers agreeing that their businesses need to take action, there was a higher proportion of decision makers stating that they had incorporated net zero into their corporate strategy. This is kind of interesting. You know, it points to potentially an internal communications issue within organisations. You know, the decisions that are being made and the agenda and strategy that's being set is not filtering through organisations so they've got visibility of net zero, or it may actually speak to the credibility issue. Decision makers believe that they're taking action, but some of their stakeholders don't agree that they're taking the right action or enough action. Okay, the other thing that we asked our clients on was, what are their motivators for net zero? Okay, we got some pretty cool responses. You know, what are the triggers? You can see them there. Grants and funding are an important trigger to imperatives. Reducing paybacks, lowering upfront costs, responding to stakeholder demands, powerful drivers of net zero. I wanted to put this up here because, you know, we understand that in every business there's a language that needs to be spoken to get a business case through the works. You need to define the current situation, address why it's a matter of urgency to resolve things, focus down on what you want your decision makers to answer, the question you want them to answer, describe the project and its benefits, describe the broader business outcomes, provide tools to assist them. And we think that there's some clues here when you're building the case for net zero action, or energy efficiency, or other investments in your business, to leverage off some of these observations. This is what decision makers and people in businesses are looking for in their business. Okay, building credibility. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time, but I'm going to move through this. Okay, sorry, yep. All right, building credibility. Transparency is really important, pointing to that difference there between decision makers and constituents across the business. And defining your net zero carbon emission boundary is really critical. Having clarity on what that is, where you've got responsibility, where you can have direct impact is really important. And then also understanding your supply chain. So beyond your, it's referred to as Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, looking into your supply chain usually as a later step. If your strategy does include carbon offsets, ensuring that they're externally verified to achieve genuine emission reduction, and I'll put up a slide briefly to talk to that. And then the third piece, committing to a globally recognised program to accredit and potentially certify that your business is got some audit trail and tracking around its net zero statements. We've signed on to the Climate Active program, which we think is pretty useful. And then the last piece, report publicly on what you're doing, so it's not a dark art, it's clear. Okay, I won't talk to this, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of language around defining emissions and how they're defined. And also just to give you a sense that there is some credibility around offsets. We do suggest that you use them wisely, but there are tests for offsets that get certified for contributing to the schemes. Okay, the other thing that we do suggest, obviously, is that you work with your advisors on your net zero. No one can get there alone. We've defined what we think is a pretty straightforward approach to net zero. Any of our account managers or myself would happily unpack the steps involved in how to achieve net zero through the energy cycle with you at any point in time. So it starts with measuring. We offer a lot of services in respect of measuring your energy usage, your carbon intensity and your footprint. Reducing energy, we're providing advice through to our clients. Looking at renewable energy options behind the meter, where we have a suite of solutions. Energy procurement, obviously a strong suit for us, embracing renewable energy and carbon reduction through your energy procurement process. And then finally, looking at offsets as you need to. Okay, our journey. I wanted to lay out for you and make accessible to you our sustainability policy, which was endorsed by our board earlier this year. I also wanted to make a comment about how important it is for internal champions to embrace net zero and display some leadership. Our net zero policy was the result of a lot of people collaborating and getting on board, but it was really led by a remarkable woman in our business who's on the panel here with me today. She's not going to get much talking time, but Janine Hill did a fantastic job of rallying everybody around the goal of net zero, demonstrating to us that it was achievable, ensuring that we understood how important it was and what we could do about net zero in our business. Many thanks, Janine. Our net zero, our sustainability policy, endorsed by the board after we had defined our footprint, makes a couple of powerful statements. One, there's a commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2020. Second, we are working to reduce the waste generated in our workplace to zero, easily through COVID times. We had pretty good waste reduction through that period. But the other statement in our sustainability policy is that we will assist our clients to manage their climate change risk through energy efficiency and renewable advice, and proactively manage their energy towards a low carbon economy. And that's what we're here to do today. We also, under Janine's guidance, prepared a net zero plan, which was endorsed again by the executive and then our board. We're very happy to report that we're making some progress on that. We've been through NABERS audits on our tenancies. We've obviously well across our electricity data. We're now looking to capture paper waste business and travel data. We've reduced our emissions through purchasing associated with our electricity use by purchasing. We're also purchasing offsets for flights that we're taking. We've made a commitment to obtain net zero certification in 2020 through the Commonwealth Government Climate Active Program. We expect to be able to achieve this through September, October this year. There's some steps that we need to do to complete this. While we have reduced our emissions, we haven't eliminated them all. We need to review our operations in Clark in the Philippines. They're serviced officers, people are working from home. We need to put some effort into how we can help them reduce their emissions too. Okay, to try and help demystify net zero for you, we will be sending you today, as a thank you for registering, an interactive net zero planning template. We're here to help you complete that if you like. Otherwise, it might just be a useful tool for consolidating action inside your business. Please have a go at starting to draft your own. Great, and that brings me slightly over time to the end of my presentation today.
Well, thank you, Ed. Well done. That was actually terrific. I've got a question. Might just kick a couple off if that's okay.
Sure. Sandy?
Talking about the COVID-19 environment we're in now, where cost is going to be, or cost management is going to be a key issue that people are facing into the future, and also the net zero goals for 2030 and 2050. Do you see those two things as being mutually exclusive?
Janine, do you want to tackle that one?
You might still be on mute.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Just cost management is going to be a key thing moving forward as we're currently in COVID-19 and hopefully shortly to come out of it. But also there's targets for 2030 and 2050 for emission reduction or net zero achievement. Do you see those two things as being mutually exclusive?
So there are opportunities to reduce cost by being more efficient. I think there is an opportunity there's innovation, different ways of doing things. That through COVID, we've had the opportunity to review. There's organisations that are looking at different supply chains. Their supply chains been disrupted due to COVID-19. They're looking at, say, 3D printers to manufacturing items. Like there's definitely different ways of doing things that make us, that means getting to, a goal by 2030 or 2050 is definitely achievable.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there too, Andy, and just point out some of the, I guess, the short-term impacts that we've seen. We're right across the forward pricing for energy, obviously, and in response to COVID, we saw energy demand drop across the economy in the short term, and prices followed. There's an opportunity there then to reduce energy costs, and so the question becomes, what do you do with the bounty that's produced? Do you look at amping up the LGCs as an energy offset, as emissions offset, I should say, or do you look at PPAs or behind the meter solar as an alternative to buying grid energy using some of those cost reductions from the grid? Also really tangible, obviously travel costs in our business have reduced dramatically, and that's a really positive emissions reduction embodied in that, and we're all getting familiar with how to do events like these.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ed. Now I notice we are over time, so are there, does anybody have any other questions? I'm not seeing any coming through in the chat, so just a reminder that everybody who registered today will be getting this presentation, and we'll be sharing that fairly shortly. So thank you, everybody.
Hang on, Andy, just before we close, there is an interesting question that's come through from Daniel in respect of councils. It's just hit the Q&A. I'll just read it out. Why should a council aim for net zero energy by 2030 when if they aim for net zero emissions by 2050, they can essentially bank the PR benefits and then ride on the coattails of their state's investment in reaching net zero energy for the entire state? That's a pretty cool question. And look, I think every council is going to have its own drivers as to how they respond. Sydney City, for example, has politically and by virtue of its profile sees the opportunity for it in leading, and perhaps the responsibility in leading the push towards net zero and taking on some of the first mover costs that they're going to have to encounter. Whereas for other councils, and let's face it, it's a pretty rich city, which relies highly on CBD rents, so a highly mobilised constituency too. Other councils don't have that luxury, and I think every council has to be evaluating what its constituents are demanding of it. I think that's the short answer to it. But there's obviously a role for councils to play in ensuring that effective action is taken by states, and there's a role in responding to the needs of your constituents.
All right, thanks for that, Ed. And thank you for the presentation today as well, Ed and Janine. That was really enlightening. And I'm sure we'll actually generate a number of questions from participants. So if there are any, feel free to call through and we'll be happy to attend to those.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Janine, and thanks, team, for helping me put this together. And thank you, everyone, for your attendance and attention. Appreciate it. Have a great day.